Hi everyone, welcome to the video. My name is James and today we're going to be taking a look at the textures. So for a game developer, textures are quite important. It's mostly the first thing gamers will see, and it will mostly determine the art style as well. And it's really important to have an art style that will fit your product or fit your world or fit your characters. And it's up to the artist to come up with an art style that will match and that will look good as well. And there are countless possibilities and opportunities to make textures in a project, and they come in all types of sizes. From small vents on the ground to complete tables or hallways, buildings, characters, everything. And mostly all of them take a different approach to create, but it's important to keep them all together and grounded in the same world. And there are a lot of different types of media you can use to create textures. And as you can see over the years, texture sizes have greatly improved. If you remember the golden days of the Nintendo 64, one of the first 3D games, games looked more flat than they do now, or they just had pictures thrown on there and just made it look as realistic as possible. And over the years, more and more detail came into the games because of the texture sizes they grew. And we as game developers have to take into account that a bigger texture will take more resources to create, will use more, has a bigger file size. So there are some concessions to make if you have to balance it for your project. And for me it's really, as a gamer and a game developer, it's really interesting to see how far we come. If you take a look at the old games, and where it transformed for me was from Nintendo 64 to GameCube was for me a small step, but it was a little bit younger then. And for me the bigger transition was from like GameCube, PlayStation 2 to Xbox 360. And I can remember playing Project Gotham Racing 3 in the store on the demo console, and like there was a windshield in the car and all the reflections, and and they had a Formula 1 game as well, and it had rain and it looked really great, and that was for me a big leap. And if I look back at it now, that was around the time that they were introducing normal and specular maps as a staple in games. And cameo elements of power for the Xbox 360 had it bumped up to 11, like with the normal maps and specular maps. So much so that they got reviewed that it was too shiny. And I can remember that they put like fairies in there with buckets to polish the world and clean it up so it would fit the lore. And that always, that's always a real fun thing to think back, that it all went painfully slow to get where we are now. And if you take a look at like Spider-Man on the PS5 or the new NBA game they revealed this week, how good it looks. And if you compared it to the old textures from say the N64 or GameCube, it's such a step forward. The size has increased from a few pixels to 4K or even bigger, and you have to try it out in Photoshop just to see how big the difference is. So for me, I thought it would be cool to look at some of the techniques and show you how you could create different kinds of textures and how they look different. But before I do that, I need a model to show you. So I've created a model from scratch, and the model I made was the Hylian shield. It's more of like a tribute to the Zelda series, as they have, like, over the years they've changed texture and art style so much. Like it went from quite realistic on the N64 to a colorful painting in the Wind Waker, back to realistic on Twilight Princess, back to almost another painting as well in Skyward Sword. And now with Breath of the Wild they struck gold with some cell shading and really nice looking realistic textures on one hand and stylized textures on the other hand. And it's I thought it would be a great idea to pay tribute to the Zelda series with all those different art styles, different kinds of textures, and make a Hylian shield to do the textures on. I made this one from scratch. In Maya, I set myself a limit of 1 hour to model it, and I didn't look at any reference because I thought, well, over all those years of playing Zelda, I should know how the Hylian shield looks like, right? And now when I look back at the footage I've recorded, I made so many stupid mistakes, but let me know in the comments if you can spot them. So let's dive right in. One of the first textures I want to take a look at are no textures at all. One of the more common techniques used now, especially in indie games, is some people will call it vertex colors. I like to call it like color shading, flat shading. It's a technique that you give full meshes, full models, full objects, one solid color, and let the engine do the shading for you. It looks really stylized, it's really calming, and it has its uses, and it can look beautiful. With this technique, instead of creating a texture, you just assign colors to various parts of your model. So in the first version, I just went in Maya and gave various polys of my model a different color. This is really awesome because I don't need to be doing any unwrapping, because it's just one poly has one solid color. But the drawback is that I needed to create like 7 or 8 materials to get all the colors in, and I couldn't put as much detail in there as I wanted because I just missing the Hylian crest on the shield. So the second one is a variation of the first one, and I will be using solid colors as well, but instead of giving the polys the color, I will use a texture. And what I did was create a really small texture with color flats on there that I wanted to use. So I made a grid like 4x4, and that's like 4x4 pixels, and 1 pixel of each color. And I got it into Maya and selected all the polys I wanted for one solid color. Did an automatic unwrap, didn't care about that at all, and just threw it on 1 pixel with that solid color, and I just unwrapped it like that. And the cool part is that if you the more colors you use, the more detail you can punch in. So like I did 3 variations of gray and faked some shadows and highlight in the rim of the model, and yeah, the metal stood out a little bit more than in the first version. And the most awesome part about that is that it's like literal 12 bytes of texture size. So you can imagine that if you're using multiple models in like a mobile game or something, then you would have no texture overhead whatsoever. And with this technique, you can even make a bigger atlas to fit more models on there, or maybe even your whole game with just simple colors and just throw them out there. It's one of the fastest texturing jobs I've ever done. It took me a literal 6 minutes to create the texture and get the model unwrapped and textured ready for Unity. Yeah, it still has some drawbacks that you can't fit in too much detail. I'm sure you can fix that with a decal over it, or a cutout, or a sprite for maybe the loft wing on the shield to get that detail in there. But then again, if I look at the possibilities with this texture setup, I think I want to try it a little bit more in the future and see yeah, how small of a texture I could use for, say, like an environment scene, just to see if I can bring it back to the absolute minimum of, like, say, 12 colors, and see if it looks good after that. So for the third version, I actually properly unwrapped the model like I would do for any other project, and that will give me a UV space to actually create a texture for. So I took the UVs into Photoshop, and for this one I just draw flat colors. So I used the mouse, I just took the lasso and selected polys and just threw in flat, and just to see what the bare minimum of the texture would be. So now I have So now that I have unwrapped the model, I have the opportunity to create smoother shapes than just follow the poly curves, and actually draw the loft wing on the shield as well. That will bring a lot more detail with it, and it's up to you to decide a scale for the texture. So with something as stylized as this, you can go quite small, like 256 would work. I tend to draw it at 2048, 2K, so that I can scale it back to a maximum of 1K in most of the games I make, but still have a slightly higher resolution if I need it in the future for like a beauty shot or promotional material or whatever. So I tend to create it one size bigger than I needed in the live project, because it's always easier to scale down and to scale up. So for the next step, I actually create a proper texture with the UV and wrap. And this time I went for a hand-painted aesthetic. I'm not the best artist out there when it comes to 2D texturing, but I loaded my UV unwrap into Procreate on the iPad, sat down for like 10-15 minutes and drew the shield. So I did some highlighting and some subtle shading with the brush and painted it in. One of the biggest games that does it like that is like most of Blizzard games, and they make proper textures. It's almost like a concept art or drawing when they finished, and it looks amazing in game. The more you shade in with the drawing itself in a hand-drawn texture, the faster it will look weird in engine if you use real-time lighting. So be aware that if you do highly stylized textures by hand, that you make sure your game environment has subtle lighting or just ambient light, and otherwise you will have highlights when it's totally dark or shadows when there's no direct light source, so keep that in mind. So for the last version, I made something from scratch, and I did it with the current industry standard tool, and that's Substance. The last couple of years, Substance has taken the industry by storm. I think that most of the current AAA games or modern games are made using Substance. At some point it just will replace Photoshop in its entirety for texture artists or 3D modelers, because you can create materials from pictures you took yourself in Alchemist and just throw your texture in there, make a PBR material out of it, and throw it out again, save it as material for use in the other Substance suite. You have Painter, where you can just import your model and paint directly on it. So hand-painted textures, you don't have to do it in Photoshop on a flat UV unwrap. You can just take the model and paint the details wherever you want them, because you can see the model. It's way more intuitive to use. It has the power to use PBR materials as well as a base, so you can just throw them on your model, see it will detect edges, so you can do really simple edge wear. You can layer everything and export it with one button press. So Substance Painter is like the go-to at this point. And then you have Substance Designer, which isn't my cup of tea because it's, for me, a little bit too technical. If you're not too great an traditional artist, I think Substance Designer is a really cool program to try, because it's completely procedural. You don't have to draw any stroke with a brush, and you can create the most badass looking materials with just nodes. Together, those three programs, you can hook them up and get your materials from one to the other and use them there. And on top of that, they also have Substance Source, which is a ridiculous large library of PBR materials that you can just browse and download to use as a base or even as a final material. I like to alter those materials myself first, or at least use them as a rough base, but it's perfectly fine if you like, you're subscribed, you can use them. It's perfectly fine to use them as a final product, because they're just that good. And that's with PBR materials in general, is they will follow the guidelines of real world values. So PBR materials tend to look similar anyway. So if you have a plaster material you made yourself or downloaded from Substance Source, or anyone else would create it, it would be similar if you were going for a realistic finish anyway. But you can make variations on there, like with paint on there, or like wallpaper or loose bricks or whatever, and that's why I tend to use it as a base. Substance, however, isn't too widely used for hand-painted stuff. You can do it in Painter, of course, because you have brushes in there you can just paint, but it is set up for PBR materials, so be sure that if you're trying out Substance, it tends to go to the PBR materials, and that will look more realistic. But yeah, I took my Hylian shield and threw it into Substance Painter, and I just used the standard materials as a base that are in Substance Painter by default. So I use some metallics, I use some modifiers to get the edge wear in, some variations on the shininess and the roughness, and I used some decals and stamps to get some more detail in there. And in the end I ended up with this, and I think that for a quick texture, like 20 minutes, 30 minutes in Substance, I think it looks good. It could use some extra work if it was for a real project, but it just shows how fast you can create decent looking materials in a program like Substance. And with this, if I want to go back and change like the color, if for example I wanted, instead of blue I want to do yellow, I could do that. Just have the layer, just select the color and just fade it into a different color and export again, and I will still have my original version if I want to. And to have all those cool options at your disposal is quite amazing. So yeah, that's for the texture making. So yeah, there you have it. There are a few techniques you could use for making textures. Of course, there are a few extra steps like creating normal maps or specular maps or roughness maps. I didn't touch on those because they're really specific for what kind of end purpose you have in mind. So like those maps for Blender will be different than the ones from Unity, and those will be slightly different from the ones in Unreal. If you're using programs like Substance Painter, they will export them for you. Unless you're doing them by hand, then you wouldn't need to think about it too much. So yeah, I really enjoyed creating this little model and doing the textures for it and show you what's possible in the different formats. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm not sure yet what I will do for the next video. I was thinking about presenting your art, 3D and 2D, because there are a lot of different ways you can do it, and I have some thoughts about that as well. Yeah, so let me know what you would like to see in the future. That really helps me determine what kind of content I'm going to create for the next video. If you like this already, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell if you'd like to be notified when the next video goes up. I want to thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.